We're going to get started in just a second. All right, we'll get started. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate everyone joining us today for a conversation about what I think is one of the most important topics in regenerative agriculture and food systems policy. My name is Ryan Peterson. I'm co-director of Climate Farm School, along with program founder Lainey Signer. Climate Farm School is an experiential food systems program, a teaching program that we host on regenerative farms across the US and in Europe. It's an opportunity for people interested in regenerative agriculture and food systems change to learn directly from farmers while spending a week away from your daily lives, living on the land, working, cooking, and eating farm-to-table food together. Many of you here have taken a course or hopefully are going to be taking a course with us. And for those who haven't, I'm also going to stay on at the end of today's call to answer questions if you're interested. And Lainey will also put a link, like co-director, when she hops on here in a minute, she'll put a link to our webpage in the chat, as well as to our guest speaker today's farm. I also want to welcome the folks joining us today from the upcoming crash course at La Junquera in Spain. Lainey and I are super excited to be facilitating a Regeneration Academy course there in May, and Regeneration Academy is also a partner of Climate Farm School. It's doing some really cool education work, and Lainey will post a link to their site in the chat as well. So policy is one of the topics that we cover in Climate Farm School because it's so critical. The unfortunate state of our dominant food system today is, when not the direct product of agricultural policy, absolutely reinforced by it. For those of us wanting and working toward food systems change, it's incredibly important to have an understanding of. So that is why I'm super grateful to Ariane, who's joining us today, an incredible guest speaker to help us learn a bit more about that. Ariane runs Tenuta San Carlo, which is a beautiful rice farm in Tuscany that I had the opportunity to visit while facilitating a Climate Farm School course last October. It was such a good experience, and Ariane had so much knowledge to share that we're actually going to be staying there for a full day and night in our upcoming course in Tuscany in May. I'm sorry to those of you on the call from our fall course who didn't get to do that. We made a last-minute sprint to the beach to squeeze in some extra time that made me decide we should make our visit a little bit longer this year. And we also asked Ariane if she'd be willing to join us for this talk today, which she graciously said yes to. Before becoming a farmer and entrepreneur of Tenuta San Carlo, Ariane worked in DC on US federal sustainable food and agriculture policy. She's an author and has worked and conducted research on organic and conventional farms in the US and Europe. She also holds a number of policy and board positions in Europe. She has served as the representative from Italy to the European Council of Young Farmers and currently serves as the president of the local organic association. She's a trustee of the Friends of Spinocchia. That's the farm and nonprofit where we host one of our Climate Farm School courses. And she also holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's of Environmental Management, from Yale. And her experience as both a farmer and advocate and in US and Europe give her a pretty unique perspective. So I'm super grateful for her being with us today. Ariane's able to spend an hour and 15 minutes. So I know that we have this call for an hour, but if anybody is able to stay on for a little bit longer, please do. And maybe we can have some Q&A at the end. We have some guiding topics for the talk today, but also want to encourage folks to use the Q&A function to ask questions. And we will moderate that. If there are questions that are immediately relevant, we'll try to bring them up while Ariane is talking. And for other questions, we'll try to come back to as many of them as we can. So at 9:15 Pacific time, Ariane will drop to make dinner for her kids. And I'm going to stay on for a few extra minutes. So with that, I just want to thank Ariane for being here with us.
Thanks, Ryan. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, Europe time. I guess it's morning and noon in the rest of the US. So yeah, excited to talk about, like you said, Ryan, a really important topic, which is policy.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it would be great to just start with a little bit more about your background. I tried to give an overview, but a little bit more of your background in policy and transitioning to being a farmer.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I have always been guided by the question, well, since I was 17, right? The question of what does a sustainable farming system look like? And, you know, I'm now 41, so when I was 17, there wasn't really, the word regenerative wasn't really in use, but I think the core principles of like, how do we build a food system that will take us into the future and is kind of sustainable on the environmental front, the economic front, and the social front. How do we get there? And over the years, that led me to work on a number of farms in the US, but it really led me also to work on the US federal farm policy, right? So I was in DC from 2008 to 2014. And so there was the end of the Bush years and a good chunk of the Obama administration. And in that time, I worked on the end of one of the Farm Bill campaigns and then a full cycle of another Farm Bill campaign, as well as annual appropriations and budgeting bills and the Food Safety Modernization Act. And so at that time, I was working essentially as a lobbyist, right? You could call it policy advocate if you don't like the word lobbyist, for a group called the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which is essentially the policy shop for what I think is everything good that comes out of that is in the U.S. farm and food policy, right? It's a coalition of member organizations that work throughout the U.S. At the local and regional level. I'm sure some of you, if you farm in the US, I see one of my former colleagues on this presentation as well. If you farm in the US, you have almost certainly interacted with an organization that is a member of this coalition on the national stage. And so we were really just like, I was fully in the policymaking process then. And then I am half Italian. I was born and raised in the US, but my father was Italian, and I inherited land in Italy, in southern Tuscany specifically. And in 2014, I decided to move to Italy and give the farm a future, basically, because or else my sister and I would have had to sell the land. And the farm is it's 1,200 acres in southern Tuscany, right along the coast, right? And so one of the main goals that I've had in managing the farm has been to apply, right, everything that I've learned from researching and working in sustainable and now more kind of regenerative food systems to actually running a farm and a farm business. And the scale and size of the farm is also a really interesting thing. It's a challenge, and it's also something that I find that, you know, is a good way to kind of really test some of the principles that are often just kind of talked about in theory, because running a farm business on 1,200 acres is a big deal. And so when I came to Italy, one of the first things I did was transition the farm to certified organic production, because right now, when I came here, there was a farm manager who had been farming the land conventionally for a long time. And so the first step for me was certified organic production. It helped me kind of restructure the business in a way that, gave it a future economically. It helped me build and find markets that meant that I could add value to the crops that I produced, and then it aligned with my values, right? Because I do come from an environmental science background, and I've always looked at agriculture through more of, a resource management lens and an ecosystem lens than anything else. And then, so certified production, and started, our own farm products, working with more high value supply chains. And right now the farm, like I said, 1,200 acres, we are in a coastal floodplain. So the farm historically grew rice, and I grow rice today as my primary crop. I also grow heirloom varieties of wheat, oats, hay, alfalfa, chickpeas, other types of wheat. There's a very large kind of crop rotation on the farm. Half of the land is in a regional park. So I have a chunk of conservation land on my farm, as well as pine forests, and a small herd of cattle, a heritage breed cattle that's very highly adapted to this environment, that I'm working on integrating into the forest management. And then a small farm stay where people come and, spend time on the farm. As Ryan was saying, the Climate Farm School came for, a tour and class last year, and this year they're spending the night. And so there is also that aspect, the tourism aspect to the farm, which is also very important for diversifying income.
Awesome.
So that's
Thank you.
basic
Yeah,
introduction.
pretty unique background. It's very cool to have somebody who has been on both sides in transition. I think often we hear from farmers who start to get into policy, but to have started your career in policy and then become a farmer, I think is really, really great. And to be continuing kind of doing that work also in a very different context. So this is a broad question, but I would love if we could just get an overview of European policy, which you've been experiencing more now, and then maybe how it compares to US policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you think about the policies that we have in place in the US and in Europe, it's important to think about the contexts of both continents, right? And so in the US, you have a foreign policy that was created as part of kind of the New Deal, that came out of the 1930s and the Depression, and then you had World War II. So you had a lot of focus on food production, right? And in the US, when you think about the US and you think about Europe, there are a couple key differences that I think really, play out in policy and how land is used in the two different spaces, in the two different continents. So in the US, you do have vast areas, right? You have a lower population density. You have very large areas that are considered rural, some that are very highly productive, in usually considered to be the kind of the Midwest, but you have a lot of land. And in Europe, instead, you have the policy also came kind of from an area of need, right? It was put together, the first European kind of agriculture policy. It's called the Common Agriculture Policy. Went into law, went into effect in 1962. So after World War II, and was really seen as one of the key unifying principles in the post-World War II era. And it's still held today as an example of one of the things that literally kind of ties the European states and countries together. But if you look at the European landscape, it is much, much more densely populated than the US, right? And rural areas are much closer to urban areas. Urban areas have rural areas that are much more accessible, and you have a different idea and structure of the rural economy too. And that over time, since the two policies have been kind of were created, that landscape element to it and the population on the landscape have played out, I think, in different ways, because the US farm policy, and I'll get kind of into the structure of both as well, but I think it's important to understand kind of the context and the actual like physical land that these two policies take place on. The US, you have vast land, right? And a lot of people who live in cities do not interact regularly with any sort of like rural area around them because it's kind of far out there. In Europe, urban areas, cities, they're surrounded by rural areas, much more highly densely populated. And so what you start to have is also rural areas that aren't just about agricultural production, but they're about what a term that's called more multifunctionality, right? That they're supposed to produce not just food, but they're areas for recreation, they're areas for tourism, and there's more of an interaction, right, between people and the landscape. I'm talking broadly. Obviously, there are exceptions, but I find it helpful to frame it that way when you think about why the policies are the way they are, because while some of the structures are the same, there are some very different kind of there are some very different pieces to the policies themselves. Yeah, so would you like me to get into some of the specific kind of structures in the policy, Ryan? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that would be great. I think particularly maybe a little bit of both. We do also have a recording I can share with people of an overview of the U.S. Farm Bill, but
okay.
But definitely maybe more focusing on Europe.
Yeah.
But some of the key differences too.
Absolutely. So the European CAP, the Common Agriculture Policy, like I said, comes from this more multifunction, like this framework that sees agriculture as more multifunctional and farmers as not just producers of food, but also like people in a rural landscape, right? And the context overall right here in Europe for the most recent CAP reforms is the European Green Deal, right, which was passed a few years ago, which was the European, Europe laid out its priorities and its goals around kind of addressing broad-scale climate change and trying to get to net zero and really putting the environment at the center of what it was trying to achieve as a continent, right? I think, well, the war in Ukraine slowed down a lot of that work, and inflation has, and we can get into kind of the farmer protests in Europe if you want later on in the presentation. But the CAP, right, has now more recently, the new CAP reform is now being implemented. And what it does is the European Green Deal has some priorities for agriculture, right? Around, percentage of land that should be going to, organic farming, decreasing pesticide use, enhancing biodiversity, and overall meeting environmental goals that have specifically to do with agriculture. So the CAP right now has 9 overall objectives that go into everything about ensuring farmer livelihood to mitigating and adapting to climate change. And these objectives are tied to the European Green Deal, right? So the way that the CAP more recently has been structured is that there are 2 pillars. This is slightly changing now as the reforms are the new reforms are coming into being. But it's helpful to think about it this way if your context is also the Farm Bill, right? Because there are two main areas of EU Common Agriculture Policy. And the first one is what you can think of and what is historically called Pillar 1, which is more traditional subsidy payments, right? It's not exclusively subsidy payments, but it's more kind of direct farm support, right? And then there's historically a second pillar called the Rural Development Pillar, which covers everything around rural development, forest management, environmental efforts, new farm issues, value chain development, supply chain development. And a lot of money goes into the programs in that pillar. The US, in the US Farm Bill, there are different, what they call chapters or titles for different kind of priorities that the bill has, but the bill is majority, kind of farm support subsidies, conservation, and then this is one of the biggest differences between the two policies. The Farm Bill in the US has the majority of the funding, or a good chunk of the funding at this point, goes to food assistance, right? In the US, you have the food assistance, one of the main food assistance programs that is funded through that bill. In Europe, you don't get that in the farm policy. Okay, so that is one of the big differences when people from the US kind of look into the European farm policy. They realize that it really is focused more on the farm and the rural development piece and less on the food and nutrition assistance piece directly.
And Ariane, do those pieces, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
I assume those exist, the nutrition policies exist elsewhere in European policy. It's just separated from.
Yeah, it's different though. They don't exist as they do in the US, right? Countries handle them differently, and there's not in the US you have the big kind of nutrition title, which is the chapter of the Farm Bill that funds the main nutrition assistance programs. You don't have that at a European scale. One of the objectives of the Common Agriculture Policy is to ensure, a continuous, safe and affordable food supply for its citizens, but you don't have a pot of money that is the same kind of direct subsidy for purchasing food. And part of that, if I take a step back, is also just tied to the different social welfare systems, right, between the US and the EU, right? And I see one of my former colleagues on the call, so maybe you can speak more of this, but the food nutrition assistance programs in the US that come through the Farm Bill are one of the most important parts of the social safety net generally in the US. In Europe, you have broader welfare states, right? Health insurance, unemployment benefits, a lot of things that go into making sure that people aren't just like falling through the cracks. So it's a different approach to how you, I don't know how to say it, like how people have the economic stability to buy food, right? That's one of the biggest differences. Absolutely.
Yeah. That makes sense. And one more question, which you might be getting to, but it seems to me, in just the way you've described it, a key difference that I often point out when I'm talking about this, so this is partially me checking myself as well, but is that the Farm Bill sort of evolved from a unified policy when it started in the 1930s, but now has become sort of this, well, it's an omnibus bill with all these different things kind of put into it that oftentimes seem like they're working against each other. And at least from the outside, it seems in Europe that, especially with this Green New Deal, that there are actually these unifying objectives that you spoke of, that now they're trying to align the policies toward. And I'm curious if there's just less disagreement, if you will, in the sub policies in Europe and
Mm.
in the US?
I think there's I think it's contested here in Europe too. In part, I mean, you're right, the approach is different, right? Because in the US, over time, a lot of things have been added onto the Farm Bill because there's a certain certainty that it's going to be reauthorized, right? And so in the US, it's becoming harder and harder and harder to just govern and get bills passed. And so a lot of things kind of have been added to the Farm Bill over time. But part of that is also just that the Farm Bill historically was a lot about just ensuring that food was produced and that people were eating and could eat, right? And so part of the work of groups like the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, from the 80s was to diversify that as well and say there are conservation priorities, there are rural development priorities, there are local and regional food systems priorities in that as well. The European, Europe works differently, right? In terms of how the overall continental governance happens, and they are trying to align all of their policies as much as possible with the Green Deal priorities. Like I said, it's contested, right? Especially now with a lot of the farmer protests going on, which are kind of a complicated thing to talk about. But Europe as kind of a group of nations, independent nations working together, have set certain goals that they're trying to align their farm policy with.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's very helpful. I think from an outsider, it's helpful to hear somebody who actually interacts with it, because the way it's presented, if you go online or just looking it up, it seems like this beautiful unified,
Yeah.
which is not what we experience here. But anyway, I interrupted with a couple questions there, but I can let you continue to talk about the structure overall.
Oh, well, I don't know, whatever I think, why don't you ask me another question, Ryan?
Sure.
In terms of just like what specifically about the structure would be helpful
I think,
to know.
what we're interested, what much of this group here is interested in the effectiveness of these policies in promoting regenerative agriculture. And so especially as a farmer who is an organic farmer, I'm curious how that plays out.
Yeah, and so I think what might be helpful is if I actually explain too, before kind of getting, into the regenerative piece also specifically, explain like how I interact with this whole like mega bureaucracy on my farm, right? And so because the farm is a certain size and I do have things like forests and animals and agritourism, there are a number of ways in which I interact with the policy. And this is the first year of the most recent reforms. And so the alignment of the Green Deal, right, the European Green Deal with the Common Agriculture Policy is kind of in its first iteration, right? And so I essentially, from the kind of subsidy payment end, right, I receive a subsidy, but now that subsidy, instead of like last year, right, up until last year, it was tied to kind of production, right? You produce on this acre, and if you produce a certain type of crop, I'll give you an additional payment. And then there's kind of a conditionality, an environmental conditionality put on the receipt of that payment as well, of that subsidy. Now, there are, at least in Italy, 5 different what they're calling eco schemes, right? And so those eco schemes, you get the subsidy payment, right? If you're participating in one of these, if you're participating in an eco scheme, right? And so for for grain crops, it's that you have to have a crop rotation, which is fine for me because I'm a certified organic farmer, so crop rotation is already part of it. One of the eco schemes is also on animals and animal welfare. And so I participate in that way with a payment per animal, right? If I meet certain standards around animal welfare. And then a couple of the other eco schemes have to do with fruit tree production and olive tree production, right? So I don't do those on my farm, so I don't participate in those. And then the last one has to do with pollinator and pollinator habitat. So you have the subsidy payment now is kind of, you have to kind of place it into one of these eco schemes, right? And then on top of that, there is also for certain crops an additional per crop payment. So I get an additional payment for either growing rice or wheat or a legume. And then there's the whole kind of rural development side, right, of the policy, and that's where I get a payment for being organic. So it's a per hectare payment. That is something that's, in Italy. So there's Europe, then there's the Italy kind of national, common agriculture policy plan, and then the regions administer so Tuscany administers then the program. And so I get an additional payment for being certified organic. And that's one of the, it fits into the overall Green Deal priorities of organic agriculture. I get I get an additional payment for having heritage breeds of cattle. And then I think one of the more interesting kind of policy mechanisms, which doesn't exist in the US, but which has been a really important part of the development of my farm, is that much of the rural development funding, it goes through and is focused on supply chain development and value chain development. And this is one of the most important pieces, I think, for if you're looking from like a policy standpoint to try to transition the current farm system into another type of farm system, because ultimately what's going to drive farmers to make transitions has a lot to do with market and market demands and supply chains, right? So as an example, when I first became certified organic, I participated in one of these regional supply chain projects focused on increasing the supply of organic products from Tuscany. And so at the base of this kind of supply chain project was a supply chain agreement between producers, processors, retailers, and then the university was involved. And that whole supply chain project was approved with like estimates of, how much we were going to produce of different types of certified organic products. And then with that kind of project approved, the rural development funding covered 40% cost share, provided 40% cost share. So grants, not loans. So a subsidy, a 40% subsidy on purchases and investments made related to that development of that supply chain. I know I'm like talking very jargony here, but what might be, an investment that I as a farmer would make, right, for a supply chain? I don't know if people want to kind of take a guess in the chat, but we're talking about investments like, a tractor, right? A grain dryer, because rice involves grain drying, like a set of investments that I made to improve my ability to be an organic producer. And through the supply chain, I already had a market because I had entered into like contracts with retailers, essentially my one of my biggest clients, and we had negotiated price ranges for 5 years. And so that allowed me to make investments, right, with then the 40% cost share from the rural development programs. And then and I had a market too. So I think when we're looking at policy, one of the most important things when we talk about like how to change the food system is really working not only kind of on farmer practices, but also on building the markets for what we want, right? And that's an example of a policy mechanism kind of in the European farm policy that you won't find in the US farm policy. And that I think is kind of one of those mechanisms that's really good for advancing alternative systems of production.
I'm curious,
value chains. Yeah.
Who approves those? And maybe you mentioned this briefly, but even more specifically, like what types of people look at the plan that you've put together and say, yes, this is sufficient and for funding?
Yeah, I mean, it's the regional bureaucratic kind of agricultural and rural development agency, right? They put out calls for applications, right? With, the goals, what they're trying to fund, right? You put together a funding project. Because it was a supply chain project, there was an external consultant involved that brought together farmers, processors, retailers. And then you're scored, right? Because the regional government has priorities that it's trying to fulfill, right? They're brought down from the national policy, that's brought down from the European policy. So if Europe says we have a goal of X amount of acres or hectares in organic production, then Italian plan will say, okay, we've got a goal of X amount of hectares of organic production. And so the regional plans will say, well, we're trying to increase, the acreage of organic farming. And so we're going to give a higher score to a supply chain that's looking to increase the amount of organic production in this region, right? That's how it trickles down.
Okay, that makes sense. Maybe so we have a few questions in the chat, and maybe I'll bring some of those in because they're all pretty related. It's hard to decide actually. But one question is touching upon the similarities and differences between farmer subsidies from the US government, wheat, soy, rice listed here, and the EU and Italian food subsidies. And yeah, you did mention this. I was curious if it seems like every crop is eligible for subsidy in Europe, and that's not always the case in the US.
Yeah, it is one of the things, thank you to whoever brought that up. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. Yes, there's a much greater so if Europe, like I said, is more densely populated, it also has a much more diverse set of crops that it's producing, right? Not that the US doesn't have that kind of crop diversity, but the policy itself, the European policy is looking to support kind of a diversity of crops because it has a diversity of countries I'm in a Mediterranean climate, but we're talking also about Northern Europe where different types of crops grow. Obviously, not that the US is some sort of small mono-homogeneous like climate zone. So there is the European policy like discriminate less against certain crops. There are additional payments for certain crops depending on the year and kind of the political winds. But a much higher diversity of crops is supported through the European farm policy. Yeah.
And then another question is, let's see, this is going back a bit to the beginning of your presentation, but what policy principles weren't feasible in practice and which were? I think this is referring when you switched to being a farmer from working in policy.
Yeah.
What actually works on the ground. Yeah. Were there any big surprises?
Yeah, the pace of change is really slow, right? Because you're talking about crop years, you're talking about when you're introducing new techniques, it takes a number of years to see how those really work, right? One of the more kind of regenerative techniques that I use is in rice production. this will be my 5th year using it, but for the last 3 years, I haven't increased the number of acres that I do that technique on, because I'm still trying to figure out, there's still some like critical problems. There's some uncertainty in that practice. And so the pace of change is slow. And then, I often think about like, making a much more diverse kind of cover crop or things like that. But all of those things do add costs in the immediate term, like in the short term, right? And one of the biggest challenges of running a farm business is liquidity, is cash flow, right? Because you have a ton of like expenses that you're paying kind of regularly throughout the year, unless you have some sort of like agreement with a bank, right? Or you're taking out a loan, but then that's always interest, and then you get paid back after you've harvested a crop, right? But when I get paid if I harvest my wheat in July, right, I'll sell it and I'll get paid, because of it, the way Italian rules are, but this is not the case in the US, like in September for that wheat, right? In the US, you'll get paid usually at delivery. But I've had costs related to producing that I've had to pay for almost a year, right? And that's just talking the strict kind of wheat costs without talking about the cover crop before the wheat, right? So when we're talking about kind of new practices, transition to new practices, there are just like real costs that go into those. And so even if you're trying to apply those principles of diversification, of not just monocropping, of, all different kinds of things, it just takes time because one, there's an economic model that you're getting out of to get into another one, right? Which is part of like a transition cost because you have upfront costs. And then it just takes time to see the effects and see what works on your land, in your climate.
Thank you for that. And I also just want to mention to folks, if you could use the Q&A feature for questions, it's just a little bit easier to keep track of, but I'll try to get to the ones in the chat here too. Another question is from Julie, your former colleague. I'm curious who covers the additional costs associated with participating in the eco schemes that you referred to. In the US, as you know, conservation payments are separate from commodity subsidies and are voluntary.
Yeah. So the eco schemes, right, are essentially tied to the commodity payments now, like to really get into it, right? In Europe, so this is the first year of kind of these new cap reforms, but even with the last cap, right, with the last kind of round of the Common Agriculture Policy, you had a percentage of your base kind of subsidy payment that was about, around 60 to 66%, depending on what country you were in, kind of thing. And then the remainder of that was tied to greening, right? Was specifically tied to your application of certain environmental practices. And because I was already certified organic, that checked the greening box. And so the eco schemes are directly tied to the subsidy payment. And so that's covered by the taxpayer.
Are there, it doesn't seem like it, it seems like this is separated, but I could be wrong. What's the differentiation of like, between organic and non-organic subsidies? You mentioned getting paid to be an organic farmer, but I'm wondering if the subsidy is higher for organic crops because the eventual price that you would garner would be higher?
Yeah, so it's the organic kind of payment is through the rural development part of the funding of the cap, right? And so when I transitioned to being certified organic, I didn't at the time get that subsidy, that payment, right? But in the meantime, because of these additional kind of directives from the EU and the new cap reform, and then how the Tuscan kind of regional government has interpreted, and those reforms, they're putting money into kind of directly supporting organic agriculture on a per hectare basis, and then transitioning to. But those subsidies, if the first year you get like 100% of a subsidy payment, they over 5 years they phase out, right? So that because the idea is that by then, I'm getting it as a plus because I have my markets and I've kind of developed them, right? But the idea is that the highest costs are up front, are in the first years of production.
Another difference, it seems, is that in the U.S. Farm Bill, a major commodity support is crop insurance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious if there is any form of insurance in Europe, or if the commodity subsidies are essentially the insurance that you're getting.
The crop insurance piece is very different, right? And in the US, it plays a much bigger role in the overall kind of farm support of the Farm Bill, where the government essentially in the US through various forms subsidizes a part of the farmer premium for crop insurance, right? In Europe, that's not the case, right? Last year was the first year that I participated in crop insurance for rice, because we had an abnormally cold and wet May, which caused a ton of problems for everything from wheat to tomatoes to olives. Like part of one of the reasons why there are farmer protests in Europe is that 2023 was such a bad year for things related very much to kind of climate variability. And so I planted my rice later than I usually do. And because that means that the production cycle might have then gone later into the fall and run up against a number of other kind of weather problems. I bought crop insurance for the first time, but it was subsidized through also it was subsidized 80% for the program that I chose, right? Because rice is my highest value crop. There's some cost share from the Farmers Association as well. So there is crop insurance available, but it's not used in this, in the US, they talk about the farm safety net. And it's not used in the same way as it is in the US. And it's not around revenue insurance, right? As much as it is kind of crop insurance, really. Kind of, if you have a hail event that takes out like the majority of your crop, then you'll get paid,
So it doesn't, so what you're referring to is like the US crop insurance, if there's a change in the market, for instance, there's a glut of corn or something and the price drops, you'll be protected on that price drop. You'll be guaranteed to get a portion of at least like 80% of what the full price you would have expected it to be.
If you're participating in revenue insurance.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what the exact percentages are because I haven't worked, not specifically. Julie, I don't know if you do, but I see my former colleague on the listening. So
like, this is not my presentation. Okay, that's helpful, because that is a major piece of the US Farm Bill and a big difference. I have a question here from Vikas, who's in one of our New York climate farm schools, and I know is very much working in policy. He said his understanding of politics around the US Farm Bill is that the pairing of food assistance programs with the agricultural subsidies creates a bipartisan coalition for the package, which makes me curious, what do the coalitions look like in Europe for regenerative farming policy?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question also to then talk about some of the farmer protests a little bit, just to kind of say that all these spaces are contested, policy is contested, right? So in Europe, you have just a different political seen, right? And so what happened with the last European elections was that the Green Party, the like greener parties of a lot of the national governments won more seats in the European Parliament, right? And so the impetus for the Green Deal and kind of very strong environmental goals from the EU level come from the fact that nationally, in a number of countries, the Green parties were strong, right, and they won elections, right, and so and there is kind of a stronger, they call them green parties, but environmental movement, right? There's a stronger environmental movement in that sense in Europe than there is in the US. And you are correct in your political analysis that the reason why the food assistance programs are in the US Farm Bill is kind of a political strategy to make sure that more kind of urban lawmakers vote for what is essentially, or what was originally a bill for rural areas. So we are now coming up to the next European elections, right, in June. And there is in Europe, a tendency to go more to the right now. The right is winning. And so the environmental parties are more on the left side of the political spectrum, and the more kind of non-environmental parties, or they have other goals, should we say, are more to the right. And what is happening, and what you've seen in the past several years, is that the right is continuing to gain more power in Europe. And so there is a real chance with the parliamentary elections in June in Europe that you'll get a majority right parliament. And so the the EU president right now, Ursula von der Leyen, knows this and sees this, and so she was the kind of author of some of these new Green Deal policies in Europe, has started to kind of take some steps back, right? And the farmer protests that you see in Europe, you have to first, so think about the political context that in June there are going to be elections, right? So there's a political aspect to this, right? And then in different countries, they were sparked by different reasons, right? For different reasons. But what I said before did hit all of Europe. We have come off of, a 2023, which was devastating on many accounts from like an agriculture perspective, specifically because of climate related things, but also because Europe is, remember Europe, like we came out of COVID and then we went right, Ukraine went right to war with, or Russia went to war with Ukraine, which had an enormous impact on Europe and the European economy and the European farm economy, with very, very high prices for all sorts of things throughout supply chains. My partner runs a large organic company that exports a great deal. They're producer processor, they export all over the world. In the months, just giving you an idea, in the months after Russia invaded Ukraine, it was exceptionally difficult to find glass jars for processing, to put food into, right? And so just like basic costs, even if you're growing like an organic tomato and you're processing it and it's awesome and it's all the good things, like you're not finding a glass jar to put it in, right? And so when we talk about increased production costs, it was throughout the entire production and supply chain, and not just at the farm level, but especially at the farm level. And then you get the inflation of the past 2 years, which yes, has slowed down, but input costs have skyrocketed, right? And then last year, devastating from like a climate perspective and a yield perspective. And so you no longer have the production to even like come close to covering your costs. And so much of the like protests, which, the causes I generally like agree with in terms of like, the fact that the costs of production are much higher, inflation has not been reflected in the prices that farmer gets, like all these things. It's just that what has happened because of the like political situation right now is that the Green Deal has been blamed, right? But the Green Deal for agriculture is just going into place now. So it's like, and because like both sides, but primarily the right, is trying to like, use this farmer anger as a way to get, more power ahead of the parliamentary elections. And so it's a big like it's a big mess, right? But the important thing is that at least people are talking about why, farmers are upset. I mean, I did not cover my costs of production last year for most of my crops. I was able to with rice, and I got some good yields too, because rice is a crop that grows really well here, but that is not the case for, the majority of crops that were grown in Tuscany or in Italy, and so the reality, we are very much at the end of one economic environmental model. I mean, if you do work in the regenerative space, right? If you do believe that like we are at a precipice or we're like already falling, that then this is like that model, the old model coming down, crumbling, right? But because of the political reality right now of things, at the EU level, they are backtracking on some of the Green Deal pieces, because they don't, the people in power, who tend to be right now center left, don't want to lose more seats to the right, right? So it's a like policy. I know that was an extensive explanation of like what I think is going on, but food is complex, right?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and that's what we're hoping to get into. Maybe on a somewhat related note to differences and just who has power. This question is from Zachary. Do EU farms have the large corporations like as common of staple producers in the US? What is the diversity and size of farm businesses? And if there is a difference, what contributes to that?
Yeah. So again, a great question. It is different from the US. I mean, Europe is going through a moment of transition, but I think the entire world is going through a moment of transition. I don't think there's like one economic sector or society sector that isn't going through some sort of transition right now. So European farms tend to be smaller than farms in the US. They tend to be more family owned and operated than the average farm in the US. They tend to be more diversified, right? That does not mean that European farmers are not participating in, global commodity markets. More in Northern Europe than in Italy. Italy has a high export of higher value items like wine, olive oil. Think about, pasta. Italy's strong point is not necessarily selling raw commodities. They're good. Italians are good at like the value added products, known throughout the world, right? And so you have smaller, more family-owned, more diversified farms. That is in some respect tied to like, policy and policy goals and keeping people on the land and farming, even when it might not be economically sustainable. And then in the US, you did have, what I'm sure you all have heard many times, in the 70s and 80s, I think more in the 80s, the get big or get out, right? And that did take a lot of, that made farmers bigger, and it did take a lot of families off the land in the US. There are, though, big generational renewal problems in Europe as there are in the US. Not as many people want to stay in farming. I mean, I think it's, things that you all have heard before and are thinking about as you try to either access land or, grow your own farm businesses. So the dynamics are different, but some of the problems are the same.
We've got another question from Julie, which I love, which is, what do you think the US could learn from the EU related to farm policy? Is there one policy or program that the EU has that you think it is possible to enact in the US that may help build a more sustainable food system? Yeah.
I think there are two main things from a policy perspective. One is in the US, essentially the environmental standard you have to meet to receive commodity payments or crop insurance is very, very low, right? And so even if it's politically challenging to do it, if there were a way to tie, effectively tie crop insurance and commodity payments to environmental outcomes, I think you would get better outcomes, right? But Julie, as well as I do, how difficult that is politically in the US. And that is something that in the EU has been happening for quite some time, right? And then what I said before about the supply chain development projects, right? That rural development funding goes really to help investments related to supply chains, right? These are all the jargony things that add value to every player along the supply chain, right? And so I think it's more challenging to think about in the US also because the US has less of like the social welfare state that we talked about and more of kind of, you don't just outright, capitalist economy. But that type of supply chain development where you get cost share funding and you're building supply chains, I think is a way to build out, to work with farms that are too small to be the mega industrial conventional farms and too big to be the farm to market farms, like the farm to farmer market farms, which is a really great economic model. Don't get me wrong, but for some farms that doesn't work, right? Because if you're a grain grower or you grow other crops or you have a certain amount of acreage. So that type of supply chain development and focusing on that and retaining value throughout that supply chain, I think is really, really important.
We have a question from Lainey. I'll read Lainey's question. She said, I'm curious about the newly formed European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture.
Yeah.
If you're involved in this work and how it's gaining traction in political coalitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a new recently founded European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture. They're wonderful. I work with a number of the farmers that are part of it, and then they was founded last year, and I am not part of the founding group, unfortunately, but they are opening up membership. And it's a great community. There is a lot of kind of the regenerative agriculture community in Europe is part of this enormous WhatsApp group that's managed by the climate farmers. I know it sounds like Climate Farm School, but the Climate Farmers Group, and they're really, really wonderful. And it's an extraordinary exchange of information and practices and resources. And there's a lot of farmer to farmer resource sharing and information sharing and skill sharing. And last year, in collaboration with that network, I hosted a regenerative workshop on my farm, and we had a great 2 days of just like comparing notes on practices and sharing experience. And so that farmer to farmer learning is something that I really like about the network. It's in its fledgling stage. There's a great policy kind of, principles and objectives paper, and then how you transform that into like policy is a big question, right? Because many of the concepts at the base of regenerative agriculture are challenging for policy systems. But I will say one of the things that I'm starting to work on, and I know a lot of farmers are starting to work on, is actually how to, and I'm sure you guys talk about this often, is actually how to measure the impact of the practices that you do on your farm. And so there's a farmer scorecard that this network is kind of beta testing. I went to a regenerative kind of food system funders meeting that there's a lot of talk about how to actually be accountable for the practices. And I think that if we talk about, really trying to make a policy that reflects a more regenerative food system, then that piece on accountability and measurement has to be part of it. and how that works in a way that's feasible for farmers to actually do and collect data and understand, and then for bureaucratic systems to integrate that into then like how they function is, I think, kind of a design systems challenge maybe that someone else can take on, but that I think is a critical step.
Lainey has her hand raised. I'll turn it over
Oh,
to Lainey.
hey, yeah, I just had a quick comment on that. Thank you so much for that answer, Ariane. And I was just gonna say this seems so rare when you have farmer-led policy suggestions and coalitions, and like the soil health law that I noticed on the ERA website seems so cool. And I feel like we've heard of a lot of inspiration from the EU about what what could be possible for policy change in the US. And I just wanted to call out, just maybe for the sake of like, I've been feeling very pessimistic about farm policy in the US, but Ryan and I did recently meet a flower farmer from Maine who's a state senator. And I feel like that's maybe not a scalable example of farmers directly participating in the policy process by becoming elected officials. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of share that for the sake of maybe some positive inspiration. But I mean, obviously, farming is a very hard job and leaves very little time for becoming an elected official. I don't know how this woman is doing that, but yeah, just to say that farmer engagement in the policy process seems like something that can ideally grow even if you're not an elected official.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's like, I don't know how many people on the call today are farmers, right? But there are, you know, through the work that the Climate Farm School does, but also other farmer like associations and local groups, and there are absolutely ways to participate, if not like directly. I mean, between like, you know, not participating in policy and being, you know, an actual policy maker, there's like a broad spectrum of how to engage, right, in the policy process. And ultimately, you know, to not be scared about it. We're having like big local debates about these farmer protests, right? And I as much as I like lead the Organic Growers Association, I also participate in a very conventional farmer association, right? Because they also do services like, you know, put your subsidy application in for you kind of thing. And so there is an exchange about like what positions should actually be taken and what makes sense and what doesn't. And in those rooms, I definitely feel nervous because I'm kind of out there, right? But at the end of the day, like me, like all the other farmers on this call, if they're like, you're the one like doing the work of running a farm business. So your experience as a regenerative farmer counts as much as anybody else's, right? And to not be afraid of sharing that. And then, you know, I don't know, this says like many young people are interested or in this type of farming, right? I think that when I go into those like local farm association meetings, it's everyone who's over a certain age, predominantly male, right? But not that that means really anything, but like we're scared of change, right? And so, I don't know, there are groups of farmers who think differently. They're hard to find, but they're out there.
Maybe related to that, Ariane, just for those on the call that are not farmers, how you would encourage them to get involved or what they can do to advocate for policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the US, just a shout out to my former employer, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and then partner kind of associations and organizations of it. If you're not a farmer, most of the farmer associations have some sort of consumer, you know, focused work for engaging other people who aren't like directly growing food. And then there are other ways. I mean, I think often local food policy councils get mentioned. I know everyone is stressed out and overworked by whatever they're doing, or maybe they are, and doesn't have a lot of time. But supporting kind of the development of an alternative agriculture system can take many different forms, and participating in local policy is one of them, just as, you know, connecting with a local farmer is another one. And, you know, participating in things like this where you're just like learning more as well. So I think there are many ways to engage, and lots of resources out there. And I think there's a big community in the US that recognizes that the US food system doesn't work as it should, you know, and so there are many different ways to plug in.
Awesome. Well, I know that you have to make some dinner, but that might be
Yeah.
a good note to end on, how people can engage. But thank you so much for this. You're an incredible wealth of knowledge, and it was really fun to just get to dive in. I'm sure we could do this for hours longer, but I really appreciate you joining us.
All right, thanks so much. Bye, everybody. And if you're in Italy, come visit the farm. I know
Yay, can't wait.
the info on the farm was shared at the beginning, just the website and social media and newsletter stuff. So if you're interested in following, please do.
Yeah, and I'll
Bye.
copy that back into the chat. Thanks, Ariane.
Bye-bye.